On April 14, 1865, a terrifying, multi-pronged conspiracy was launched with a single goal: to decapitate the entire United States government. The shot fired at Ford's Theater was the only successful strike in a broader mechanism of violence, designed to shatter the Union command. John Wilkes Booth was one of the most famous and highly paid Shakespearean actors in America. Beneath the celebrity exterior, he was a radicalized operative who used his theater tours to smuggle medical supplies and pass intelligence to the Confederacy. In late 1864, Booth recruited a team to kidnap the president. The goal was to ambush Lincoln's carriage, smuggle him to Richmond, Virginia, and hold him hostage to force the Union to release thousands of Confederate prisoners of war. To pull this off, the conspirators needed a safe house. They used a Washington, D.C. boarding house run by Mary Surratt, where they stockpiled ropes, pistols, and chloroform for the abduction. But the timeline collapsed. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered his army at Appomattox. With the Confederacy effectively defeated, there was no longer a Southern government left to negotiate a prisoner exchange. Stripped of his leverage, Booth pivoted to a synchronized terroristic strike. He assigned his men to eliminate 4 pillars of command: President Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, and General Ulysses S. Grant. The plot began to fracture almost immediately. The strikes were set for 10:15 p.m., but General Grant canceled his theater invitation at the last minute and boarded a train out of the city. Across town at the Kirkwood Hotel, a German immigrant named George Atzerodt had rented the room directly above Vice President Andrew Johnson. His orders were to walk downstairs, knock on the door, and stab the vice president in his bed. But Atzerodt's nerve failed him. Instead of heading upstairs, he went to the hotel bar. He drank heavily, asked the bartenders suspicious questions, and eventually wandered out into the street, tossing his knife into a gutter. Booth had designed a highly complex operation, but he staffed it with low-level accomplices who lacked the discipline to follow through. The grand conspiracy was falling apart before anyone had even drawn a weapon. At 10:10 p.m., a former Confederate soldier named Lewis Powell approached the Lafayette Square home of Secretary of State William Seward. Seward was completely bedridden, recovering from a catastrophic carriage crash. Powell talked his way past the servant at the front door by claiming he was delivering urgent medicine from a doctor. He made it to the top of the stairs before Seward's son, Frederick, blocked his path. Powell aimed his revolver straight at Frederick's forehead and pulled the trigger. The weapon misfired. Unfazed, Powell bludgeoned Frederick over the head with the heavy iron barrel until it broke, drew his Bowie knife, and charged into the secretary's bedroom. He slashed violently at Seward's face and neck in the dark. But the recent carriage accident actually saved Seward's life. He was wearing a rigid metal jaw splint, which deflected Powell's blade away from his jugular vein. Fighting off Seward's other son and a military nurse, Powell stumbled out of the blood-soaked room and rushed into the street. But the screaming had terrified his getaway guide, David Harold, who had already fled into the night on horseback, leaving Powell totally alone. A surgical metal brace and a terrified accomplice turned a guaranteed assassination into a messy, failed assault. Seward survived, keeping another piece of the Union government intact. While Powell was fighting in the dark, John Wilkes Booth arrived at Ford's Theater. Because he was a beloved star who practically lived at the venue, he walked right past the ticket takers and stagehands without anyone questioning his presence. He easily bypassed the one man who could have stopped him. The president's assigned bodyguard for the evening, a police officer with a history of disciplinary issues, had left his post during the play's intermission to grab a drink at the saloon next door. Booth had prepared the space that afternoon. He had drilled a small spy hole through the door of the presidential box to monitor Lincoln's exact position. Once inside the outer hallway, he wedged a piece of wood against the door behind him, sealing himself in. He waited for the funniest line in the play, Our American Cousin. At exactly 10:15 p.m., as the audience erupted in laughter, Booth stepped forward and fired a single .41 caliber lead ball into the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. Major Henry Rathbone lunged at the assassin, but Booth sliced his arm to the bone with a dagger. Booth vaulted over the balcony rail, caught his riding spur on the decorative flag, snapped a bone in his leg as he hit the stage, and limped out the back door to his waiting horse. Booth's intimate knowledge of the theater's architecture and his precise execution allowed him to succeed where the rest of his network completely collapsed. Soldiers carried the unconscious president out of the theater and across the street to a small first-floor bedroom in the Peterson boarding house. The bullet was lodged too deep to extract. At 7:22 the next morning, Abraham Lincoln passed away. A massive Union cavalry detachment hunted Booth through the Maryland swamps for 12 days. They finally cornered him in a Virginia tobacco barn, set the building on fire, and shot him through the neck when he refused to surrender. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton immediately launched a ruthless dragnet. Within days, investigators traced the weapons, the escape routes, and the aliases right back to Mary Surratt's boarding house, arresting dozens of suspected accomplices. Because this was an act of war, the accused faced a military commission rather than a civilian jury. On July 7, 1865, Lewis Powell, David Harold, George Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt were marched to the gallows at the Washington Arsenal and hanged simultaneously. Booth's one successful bullet robbed the nation of the leader it needed. As the broken country began the grueling process of reconstruction, it did so without the steady hand of the man who had seen the Union through its darkest hours.